Before we dive into this research, I want to draw your attention to some questions to keep in mind throughout the lecture. Number 1. According to the essay, how are addiction and poverty related? How are they unrelated? Explain. Number 2. What would you propose as a solution to addiction's disproportionate effects on people in poverty? Don't forget to use a specific example. Number 3. According to Peter Grinspoon, MD, what is the main cause of addiction for people in poverty? He is one of the sources within the reading. And finally, number 4, what are your biggest takeaways from and questions remaining about the reading? Now let's dive into the topic. Between a rock and a hard place, why addiction disproportionately affects people in poverty. The introduction is composed of 2 main parts. The first is topic and background. The second is an overview of the paper, some additional supporting information, and my primary argument. In the words of Carl Gustav Jung, every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. The idea that addiction does not discriminate is only accurate in the sense that anybody can or may be an addict. However, addiction has seemingly more severe effects on people who are living in poverty. According to research done by the United States National Library of Medicine, across 17 states in 2002 to 2014, opioid overdoses were concentrated in more economically disadvantaged zip codes. The nature of substance use disorder is often more pertinent to those struggling financially or those below the poverty line. Circumstances such as unemployment, comparatively lower income to the median household, and high stress levels tend to have more noticeable impacts on those in poverty as well. Substance use is an accessible, unfortunate coping mechanism for painful feelings such as anxiety, depression, and loneliness, which can be brought on by stress and can often make these mental health problems even worse among those who have little or no access to mental health care. Consequently, those in poverty spend a decent portion of their income on their substances of choice. In some countries, the impoverished population could spend up to 30% more on food than it actually does, just based on what it spends on alcohol, tobacco, and festivals. Without ready access to disposable income, people tend to spend what little money they have on necessities for the basic needs of survival, such as nourishment, shelter, and heat. However, this research explores the role and impact of addiction in people's consideration of substances as a necessity. Moving on, the factors that simultaneously affect addiction and poverty are also known as social determinants of health, or SDOH. According to the World Health Organization, or WHO, they are defined as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. These circumstances are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at global, national, and local levels. Similarly, the effects of poverty are often in direct alignment with the risk factors for the development of an addiction. This article examines the 2 primary causes of addiction, their risk factors, and their disproportionate effect on people in poverty via research and statistics. According to the Mayo Clinic, environmental factors such as a family's beliefs or an association with a peer group that condones or partakes in drug use seem to influence initial drug use and experimentation during adolescence. Peer pressure, broken homes, and the abundance of external stressors often affect people in poverty more than those with financial stability. Additionally, genetics play an essential role in both the development of and the ability to recover from an addiction. The 2 primary genetic risk factors, a family history of addiction and a predisposition to a mental health disorder, tend to make a more significant toll on those in poverty due to a lack of access to proper health care and addiction treatment. While some may believe addiction leads to poverty, this research validates the disproportionate effects environmental and genetic factors have on the development of addiction in impoverished persons. Moving into the arguments, I begin by discussing environmental factors as a cause of addiction that disproportionately affects people in poverty. Environmental factors substantially contribute to the development of addiction in people in poverty. For example, lack of access to healthcare often prevents people in poverty from seeking proper therapy to cope with their stress and emotions, while also preventing them from seeking treatment for substance use disorder. For example, if a person in poverty is constantly worrying about how they are going to afford nutrition, housing, heat, air, water, childcare, and any other necessities for survival, would cause an extreme amount of stress buildup. Financial insecurity is often exacerbated by sudden unemployment. Loss of income may result in the loss of access to housing, organization, and security in their lives. Lack of organization may make it far more difficult for them to care for their families, attend medical appointments, and make it to support groups such as Alcoholics or Narcotics Anonymous, grief groups, and more. According to Professor Peter Grinspoon at Harvard Medical School, they may also have trouble filling prescriptions, setting a time to practice self-care, or even finding time to relax, decompress, and emotionally process their day. According to the Mayo Clinic, a lack of family involvement or of a bond with your parents or siblings may increase the risk of addiction, as can a lack of parental supervision. Although some may believe that people are responsible for their own emotional development, the social determinants of health, such as the effects of parents' behavior, are vital in shaping a child's future. Additionally, parents tend to set an example for their children, who are far more susceptible to peer pressure due to their naivety of their age. A child's predisposition to regular use of alcohol and drugs normalizes the concept of frequent substance use or abuse. Peer pressure is a strong factor in starting to use and misuse drugs, particularly for young people. For example, suppose a child grows up in a household where everybody consumes their first alcoholic beverage or drug of choice before noon. In that case, that kind of behavior becomes normalized in their everyday lives and has the potential to negatively influence their opinions and attitudes about substance use. Additionally, partaking in drug use before the brain has fully developed can change the speed and manner in which the brain develops and increase the likelihood of progressing to drug addiction. Due to the unpredictable nature of addiction, it is nearly impossible to determine how it may affect different people with respect to their genetic background. Developing an addiction to drugs may lead to criminal charges, one or both of which may result in unemployment. Loss of income is likely to usher in a state of financial insecurity and stress, thus, the cycle of poverty repeats. The second argument discusses the adverse role of genetics disproportionately affecting the development of addiction in impoverished communities. If not appropriately treated, addiction can have a severe impact on the family of the addict, whether that be through emotional trauma or genetics. Certain genetic factors play an unavoidable role in the development of addiction and disproportionately affect those experiencing poverty. If not appropriately treated, addiction can have a severe impact on the family of the addict, whether that be through emotional trauma or genetics. Certain genetic factors play an unavoidable role in the development of addiction and disproportionately affect those experiencing poverty. According to the Mayo Clinic, the leading genetic risk factors for addiction are family history of addiction and/or mental health disorders. Mental health disorders are considered a risk factor for developing an addiction and vice versa. One is often a consequence of the other. For example, those with depression, ADHD, or PTSD are more likely to develop an addiction. An immediate family member, such as a parent, grandparent, or sibling with such a history, is likely to increase the individual's susceptibility to developing an addiction or developing a mental health disorder. Additionally, genetics severely impact the speed at which and the order in which the diseases progress. As another example, suppose two people with a genetic history of alcoholism begin consuming alcohol at the age of 13. In that case, their genetics will play a role in determining which person's addiction develops more quickly. Alternatively, excessive drug use and alcohol use during addiction often lead to the development of anxiety, depression, and other mental health disorders as a result of post-acute withdrawal syndrome, also known as PAWS. PAWS are the residual effects of withdrawal that addicts experience for up to 2 years directly following their substance detox. Due to people in poverty's lack of access to healthcare and disposable income, they are less likely to seek treatment for addiction or therapy to improve their mental health. As a result, generational poverty and a family history of addiction often go hand in hand. Even with treatment and a substantial support system, recovering from an addiction or a mental illness is a time-consuming, lifelong commitment. Most people cannot afford to be unemployed for 2 weeks, let alone the 4 required in specific addiction treatments. To conclude my argument, social determinants of health disproportionately affect impoverished people's likelihood of developing an addiction due to the inherent nature of life in poverty. People in poverty often lack access to appropriate mental and physical health care due to their inability to afford it. Specifically, untreated mental health disorders may lead to heightened stress levels, sudden unemployment, lack of income, and family or marital conflict. These factors, as well as social segregation, peer pressure or social influence, an unstable home or social environment, and recreational drug use, could all be considered both effects of poverty and risk factors for addiction, demonstrating the close links between the two. Additionally, genetic risk factors are an unavoidable and equally critical component of a person's susceptibility to developing an addiction. Children with parents, grandparents, siblings, or other immediate blood relatives who struggle with addiction are far more likely to develop the disease themselves. When discussing specific solutions to poverty as a whole, it is critical to address the social determinants of health as a high priority concern, as the inequalities of such are primarily based on the distribution of wealth and have a severe effect on an impoverished person's susceptibility to developing an addiction. Although some people may believe addiction is a choice, this evidence supports the claim that risk factors for addiction disproportionately affect people in poverty. Although some may argue that people in poverty choose not to use free addiction recovery resources such as Alcoholics Anonymous, it is often the case that they do not have enough time outside of work and child or family care. Genetics is a primary social detriment of health that negatively and disproportionately affects and impacts people in poverty's likelihood of developing an addiction.